Hosein Kouros-Mehr. Welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thanks. Great to be here, Elliot.
It's a pleasure to have you. I'm excited to dive into our topic of conversation. I have a feeling it's going to be super insightful and very, very fascinating for myself and the listeners today. But before we do dive into it, can you give us a bit of context about who you are, what it is that you do?
Absolutely, yeah. Hosein Kouros-Mehr. I'm a cancer drug developer. So I've been involved in this for over 2 decades now, about 24 years, trying to understand cancer and develop new medicines for cancer. And I recently wrote a book called Breakthrough, Master Your Default Mode and Thrive, which is about the default mode network. So I've been sort of at the cutting edge of science, and it's taken me here, which is really at the cutting edge of neuroscience. And we can talk about that default mode network.
Yeah, it's super, super fascinating. Before we do go on to the default mode network, I saw that you mentioned in one of your social media posts that you believe that we could cure cancer in this lifetime. What gives you that hope and that hypothesis?
Yeah. So this goes back, 25, 26 years ago when I read a book in high school called The Human Genome Project. This is back in 1996 or so. And it talked about how this Human Genome Project, the sequencing of our genome, is going to revolutionize cancer, under the understanding of cancer and the treatment of cancer. And that's basically what I've seen over the last 25 years. 25 years ago, we couldn't imagine the medicines we're developing today. I mean, I am seeing patients cured of their cancers who would not have been, 2, 3 decades ago. And it's just the beginning. So we're developing cell therapies, gene therapies, antibody therapies. We're understanding how cancer works and we're attacking it. So this war on cancer, I think the tides are turning. I think we're starting to see some really good progress. So yeah, hopefully in our lifetime, it's some cancers hopefully will be curable. So that's
incredible. And given how fascinating and how life-changing that work is, why are you working on the default mode network?
Yeah. Well, funny enough, that Human Genome Project that I mentioned, that opened the door. It really starts with understanding, right? When we understand our genome and we understand cancer, that opened the door to oncology and other, fields within medicine. I think the same is happening now in neuroscience. When we start to understand the brain, we now understand there are at least 7 networks in the brain. We can talk about those. But these are parts of the brain that connect to perform a function. And what I'm seeing now in neuroscience, as we're starting to understand how the brain works, this is going to open the doors for the next 2, 3 decades to treatments and things we can't even imagine right now. So we're at the cusp of this next revolution, I think, in neuroscience, mental health, mental well-being, and all of it connecting with spirituality and science and medicine. It's all coming together. So it's just incredibly exciting.
Got you. Too exciting and too transformative to stay away from by the sounds of it. So let's get down to business and really go through definitions first so people understand what we're talking about. What is the default mode network to begin with?
Yeah. So I mentioned those 7 brain networks, right? So some of those you're familiar with. Visual network, right? This is how we can see. The auditory network, it's how we can hear. There's sensory-motor network, how we can move around and feel. So there's 3 networks that are the key here to mental health and mental well-being. One of them is called the default mode network, which is essentially your self. It's your ego. It is the storyline of you that you are generating. For the longest time, we didn't have a name for it, right? 2,500 years ago, Buddha said, where is the ego? Where is the self? It can't be found. Well, it is found. Now we found it. It's called the default mode network. So you'll recognize it anytime your mind wanders away from the present. For me, it's when I'm brushing my teeth or I'm driving, focused, let's say, on the road, and suddenly my mind goes away from the present. I go back into the past, a conversation I had yesterday, a memory from 20 years ago, right? That's the default mode network that switches on when your mind wanders away from the present. So we all need a healthy default mode network for self-reflection, to form memories, to make decisions. But for many of us, that default mode network is overactive, and we have a hard time staying present in the moment. And so we're back in the past, we're thinking about the future, and it can give rise to what I call 11 mental knots, things like stress, emotional pain, anxiety, addiction, which I call addictive craving, negativity and others. So the goal, and what this book does, it's a book of healing and a book of self-discovery. It has you understanding your default mode and understanding why your brain is doing what it's doing with the purpose of healing it. And so the goal of the book is for you to understand your default mode network, recognize it, and to heal it. And in the process, free yourself from some of these issues like stress, anxiety, and pain. So it's really written for people who are struggling with those conditions, but it could be read by anyone who just is curious about how their brain works.
Yeah, I think realistically, on some level, we all have the challenges of human existence, which comes along with all those things that you've spoken about. And obviously, some are worse than others. Some have different positions in their mental health, which are more challenging than some at certain stages of our lives. But at some level, I think all of us can relate with that as well. So when it comes to understanding that default mode network and having one that's healthy and productive versus one that's maybe a little bit too overactive and borderline obsessive, where do we go about finding out where we're on the scale to begin with to know whether we need to scale it back or whether we need to essentially just allow ourselves to be where we are?
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned like stress, for example. We all experience stress. Stress is a normal part of life, right? Stress is what helps you get through a difficult time. I mentioned driving. If you're driving and you see a pothole ahead on the road, your stress response kicks in, your heart races, you grip the wheel, you do what you need to do to get out of danger. Your stress response just saved your life, right? We all experience stress. Stress is normal and healthy. But when the default mode is overactive, we can be in stress all the time because of our thoughts, because of a wandering mind that's overactive. So I think it's some self-reflection. Look inside and say, do you feel happiness inside, light inside? Or when you look inside, is there some pain? Is there too much pain, for example? And so that's where it comes from. What is your intention, right? And I think that's a key part of this. If you feel like you're not in a good place and you have an intention of, I want to be in a better place, I think that's the time where I would pick up this book or start to understand yourself a bit more and get yourself on the right track, basically. Only right? Rumi said it's yours and your road and yours alone. No one can walk it for you. So this is ultimately something you want to do some reflection and understand yourself a bit more. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I can imagine that it starts at a super young age as well. You mentioned to me off air that you've got 3 young children. Do you think about their default mode networks?
Yeah, all the time, actually. It's really interesting. So I have a 2.5-year-old who is, he's fully present. When I'm with him, he just experiences life. He's not forming ideas and concepts about what he's seeing. And so his default mode network hasn't really formed yet. My 5-year-old, I'm seeing her default mode network is on. She's, questioning things that happen and, is this bad or is this good? So again, we all need a healthy default mode network to survive, right? And hers is just forming. So I'm starting to see she's sort of, old memories come back and she's thinking about things. Why did this happen? What if this bad thing I saw on TV happens, right? Those kinds of things are forming. It's really during puberty when default mode network really kicks in and we need to form, we form an identity, right? We form that storyline that is ourself. But we also have this idea that we are different from others, right? That's default mode network that gives us this feeling that we are different from others. So I think it's fascinating, but keep in mind, I mentioned 3 brain networks that are critical for mental well-being. One of them, default mode. There's another one called central executive network. And that one has a more expansive consciousness. And I call it the observing mind, right? When you're practicing mindfulness, you tune into your observing mind, right? You watch your thoughts. So what you're doing in mindfulness and prayer is you turn on that observing mind, that central executive network. And these 2 networks are sort of vying for our time and attention. And there's a 3rd network called salience network, which shuttles us between these 2 networks constantly throughout the day. So these 3 networks are really, I think, at the gateway to mental well-being and that higher self that people have talked about. So yeah, it's all really fascinating science that's emerging.
And is there a encouraged percentage of which one of those we should be in at any given time, or does it really depend on who you are and what you're doing? Maybe on a conversation in today's world, we might be able to need, the thinking mind and all of that stuff if we're making high level decisions in our workday, for example. But if you're hanging out with your kids on the weekend, perhaps you can tone that down a little bit. Do we adjust it day to day based on certain circumstances
Absolutely.
and situations?
Absolutely. So let's say if we go through a very difficult time, if we experience some trauma, that default mode network suddenly kicks into overdrive. We're constantly revisiting, let's say, a really difficult conversation we had with somebody. We may wake up in the middle of the night, consumed by it, thinking about it all the time. But that default mode, we are also trying to process what happened. And healthy people, they'll take sort of learnings from that, apply it to their lives, and they can move on. But for people suffering from an overactive default mode network, they may be stuck in that for a very long time, not able to move on from it. So, victims of war, let's say, or people who've experienced a car accident, a divorce, some sort of trauma, their default mode network may be overactive to the point that they're just constantly revisiting that, and it gives them some post-traumatic stress disorder where they're just not able to be present. And so how do you heal from that? I think part of it is understanding yourself and learning how to silence and heal that default mode network, I think can allow you to move on. But again, we're all different. So.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. And it really comes down to the individual and where they're at. But obviously, I think that maybe, and this is a question that you can probably answer better than I can, do you find that some people are almost from a hereditary level almost more inclined to be someone who is more in their default mode network than other? Because I think that maybe you're observing this with your children as well. Maybe you will as they grow older and older as well. You'll always hear that someone says, they've always been a little bit more analytical. They've always been more of a free soul and a free spirit. Does that have a lot to do with just your genetic makeup?
Yeah. So as a scientist, what I would say is we're just now starting to understand that aspect of it. And this is all relatively new science. So I'm not aware of studies that have shown that an overactive default mode is genetic. I'm actually not aware of that. So I think for your young listeners out there who may be looking for a new hot field to work in, I mean, this is one. I think we're just beginning to understand this. And that is a really good question, actually. I think we can answer. But I think one important thing is the brain is plastic. There's neuroplasticity, which means we are able to change our mind. So even if there is a genetic component, we can, train our brains and change our brain. So let's say somebody has been stuck in their default mode. It is possible to sort of break free from that and spend more time with intention and practice, spend more time in that central executive. Right. And so I don't think it's completely genetically like hardwired. There may be some component of it, but I think a lot of this can be, with effort and training, I think we can sort of free ourselves and tap into that sort of higher mind, that observing mind.
Yeah, and I can imagine, the long-term goal, and who knows, with all the developments being made on, Elon Musk putting chips in people's brains, potentially there will be a button in the future where we can flip between those two modes. But ideally, the goal would be to do that without the intervention of technology, right? It should be in a place where we can just literally flip between those in a conscious manner.
Absolutely. Let's talk about what are ways that you can sort of silence that default mode when it's overactive. So what's been shown scientifically to silence your default mode is mindfulness exercises, such as a breath meditation. Prayer, I consider prayer a form of mindfulness exercise when it's, it can calm the default mode network. Beyond that, there are some actual medications that can do it. And this is all, again, relatively new science, but it turns out plant medicines, psychedelics,
makes sense.
That's how they work. They shut off the default mode. Now, Mindfulness meditation will shut off the default mode and turn on that observing mind, that central executive. Plant medicines will shut off the default mode network, but they connect the entire brain, parts of the brain that don't normally connect. So I think meditation, mindfulness is a much healthier way. I think people want like the instant fix, but I think give it 5 or 6 weeks, and prayer, mindfulness exercises, I think can really do wonders. But the plant medicines are just starting, right? I mean, we're just starting to understand how these plant medicines work. I think we're going to see a new wave of therapies over the next decade that can silence your default mode without all of these crazy side effects. And so hopefully we don't need a neural chip like Elon Musk is developing, but I think we can develop better medicines. Just as we did with cancer and we did with cardiovascular, where those initial drugs came from plants, chemotherapies and blood pressure medicines originally came from plants. We understood how they worked, and we developed newer generations from all of that. So,
and how long do you see that from being available for someone?
Well, there are clinical trials ongoing for, let's say, psilocybin in refractory depression. There's actually a clinical trial already going. There's one for MDMA-assisted therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. Those may be approved possibly in the next year. Now, when they get approved, it doesn't mean you can just go out and try it, right? You have to do it in an assisted setting, somebody who's licensed. All of that takes time, but it is coming. So I know we want something to happen now, but I would just say, plant medicines are powerful, right? These are if you had, God forbid, if you had cancer, you wouldn't want to go out and play around with chemotherapy, right? Experiment with chemotherapy. So I would be just really careful about experimenting with plant medicines and not knowing what you're doing. You can get into a lot of trouble, and it can do more harm than good. But yeah, so
you have a lot of optimism for plant medicine, essentially.
I have. Oh yeah, I think it's clearly helped people. Look, refractory depression. These are patients who have such severe depression. They've had all of the standard treatments. It hasn't helped them. The standard treatment for refractory depression is called ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. It's basically shock therapy. They shock your mind, and I've seen it done. It does help people. So obviously it's approved for a reason. But I think we can do better, and I think the clinical trials for these plant medicines look pretty encouraging, I have to say. So,
and when it comes to giving that type of plant medicine to someone in the future, perhaps when it's fully rolling, it's been approved, will it be based on a diagnosis that's given by a psychologist or a clinician, or will it be done based on a brain scan?
Oh, wow. It will be based on a diagnosis made by a physician or somebody who's licensed to make that decision. The brain scan is interesting. We may see that in 5 or 10 years, because you can see the default mode network on an MRI scan. You can actually see it. Oh, wow. And there's a study where they put people in an MRI, and they sort of scan their brain, and they had people who were meditators and non-meditators, and then so the study was they would play this whistle, and 10 seconds later there would be like a very mild zap, right? And so the non-meditators would hear the sound, their default mode network would shine, and they would just have all this anxiety and tension. The meditators, they heard the sound, and there was nothing in the brain. There was relative calm and silence. They didn't feel that anxiety. So you can definitely pick these up on a scan. And by the way, this is, I think, what is appealing. There's a lot of people out there who need help, and they've tried mindfulness. They've tried, they've read all the books out there by folks, the Buddhists, non-Buddhists, etc., and they don't quite get it, right? Maybe they're scientists, or maybe they're people who need some of that science, that practical element. We have it now. And this book, the Breakthrough, combines that emerging science with the classical, teachings from Buddhism, from Christian practice, it brings it together. So it's especially, great for those people who are a bit skeptical.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to the mental health challenges that we're going through today, which are more prevalent than ever and definitely more spoken about than ever as well, which is fantastic, how much is the default mode network contributing to this mental health epidemic, I guess we could call it, that we're going through right now?
I think it's a massive contributor, especially now that we're all, on our phones, 4 hours a day on average. And so our, brains are on overdrive. Our default mode network is in overdrive. We're constantly caught between craving this and disliking this and judging this on our phones. And what it does is it creates high levels of glutamate in the brain. And that makes the stress response prevalent. So, thousands of years ago, our stress response was from predators, from invasions, right? And now our stress response is from our own thoughts. And we're just so distracted and so wired. So all of this sets up for an overactive default mode, which I think is contributing to our high levels of stress, emotional pain, our anxiety, our negativity, our loneliness, big topic, our loneliness, our anxiety, our dissatisfaction, and poor lifestyle. Poor diet, poor exercise, poor sleep, and our sort of stubbornness. I think default mode network is contributing to all of it. But the good news is we can turn the tide back through an intention to improve and a self-understanding. Those are the first two things you need. We could turn the tide back.
And without people going ahead and diagnosing themselves, but at least gaining some self-awareness, is it fair to say that if you experience high amounts or even intermittent amount of anxiety or depression, it's highly likely that you have that default mode overactive?
There's a good likelihood, right? If you're, let's say, constantly having thoughts such as, I'm not worthy enough. Let's say anytime your mind wanders, there's some pain that you feel. There's some, linked to some old memories or these thoughts. That could be a default mode network. So once you recognize that and you have those thoughts, you realize, oh, that's my default mode network giving me that thought. That's not who I am, right? It's not that I'm worthless. I'm just having a thought that I'm worthless. But I think it is important to tell others about this. Don't do this alone, right? There is online therapy out there. There are so many resources available, cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavior therapy, and so many options, and Alcoholics Anonymous and just online support groups. And so the self-understanding is very important, but get the help you need. Tell people about it, because that's critical for a lot of people too.
Absolutely. And what are some of the other type of situations that we can be going through if we do have an overactive default mode that aren't anxiety, that aren't stress, that maybe we wouldn't expect? Like, we might make sense of the fact that if we're spending too much time in the present, well, not that spending too much time in the present is probably a good thing, but spending too much time in the future or the past, then we get an understanding of that. But what are some of the surprising symptoms that we could probably put down to the overactive default mode that perhaps we wouldn't expect?
So, anxiety is one. Anxiety is an interesting one because, what is it? It's normal and healthy to have anxiety. Right? Anxiety is sort of an unease about the future. If you get a urgent email from your boss saying, I need to meet with you later today, you're going to have some anxiety. You're going to worry about what is this conversation going to be about. You may have a little bit of panic, worry. Maybe you plan for this. But when that default mode is overactive, you may feel completely paralyzed. And some people may worry about things that actually aren't real triggers for most other people. Like, so people who have obsessive compulsive disorder or phobias, right? They have an irrational level of worry that is disproportionately greater than what they're actually experiencing. And that anxiety can manifest in many different ways. There may be phobias, fear of social situations, fear of flying. There could be post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, social anxiety disorder. So, that anxiety can manifest in so many different ways, but it's all part of this spectrum. And you know, why the default mode network leads to phobias in some people and obsessive compulsive in others, we're still sort of beginning to understand that. But that's one where massive, you know, health and well-being impact for a lot of people. But there is hope, and again, healing is possible, right? Healing is possible. It starts with intention and self-understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously you felt so strongly and passionate about this concept that you went ahead and wrote a book. And what is it exactly that you explored in this book that was different to, say, the chimp paradox, for example, or Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now? You know, concepts, in theory, we've heard about this concept before in the sense of, you know, the power of consciousness and the power of presence and all these other things, and also the monkey mind, as it's been commonly termed as well. So what makes this discovery any more, you know, different from those? And also, what did you explore in that book to give us some fresh and new insights that we may have not heard about before?
Excellent. I love those books. I love Eckhart Tolle. Power of Now was instrumental for myself several years ago when I read it. I think what was, and again, not to take away from Eckhart Tolle, he is one of my heroes, but
and he's listening to this podcast. Yeah, I hope he is anyway.
Yeah, let's hope so. I think this story is as old as time, right? This is sort of the taming of our ancestral fires, right, from thousands of years ago when we evolved into Homo sapiens. This story has been told by Buddha. It will continue to be told by others. What's new now and in this book is the dimension of science that has entered into this. And it's a big dimension. I mean, when you see clinical studies showing the health benefits of forgiveness and the other parami, the other, let's say, Buddhist and Christian principles that are at the heart of those religions, and you actually see clinical data showing that compassion reduces cortisol levels by 50%. And by the way, look at the effect on diabetes. That's a whole new dimension entering this. And there are a lot of people out there who I know have tried reading Eckhart Tolle and they couldn't quite get into it. What's the point of it? Why am I doing this? And I think the science entering this creates it's a bit more pragmatic and so I think people can get it. So I have family members who I brought up, let's say, mindfulness, meditation, Buddhism, and they're like, their eyes roll. They're like, I'm not interested in any of that. And then I gave them this book, and they're like, oh, central executive and default mode. I can see it on a scan. They got it. They're like, oh, okay. And they've read it. So yeah. Again, but
got you. So yeah, there's more stable foundations in which it's standing on right now, rather than someone who, you know, for example, again, Eckhart Tolle is a fantastic author and fantastic at what he does, but not extremely relatable, you know, in the sense that if you do read the book and you do read anything about Buddhism or, you know, encompassing your inner Zen, for example, it's really hard to relate to those type of people. And again, you don't think you're necessarily living in an ashram in India. So it's like, how does it have anything to do with my modern life in LA or the UK, right?
Yeah. You know, I've sort of distilled what is the essence of Buddhism and Christianity. What is the essence that is critical for us for our health? And how does it tie in with this emerging science? And so, you know, these 11 knots I talked about, I had all 11 of them. I was able to find a much better place and sort of put all those findings here in this book. And yeah, I didn't have time to go on a Vipassana retreat. So I did Vipassana myself. I did it myself. I had to wake up, 5 a.m. before my kids woke up. I've got 3 kids. And yeah, I don't have the luxury of going off to a retreat. And so that pragmatism is reflected in this book. And so, yeah, but again, we need Eckhart Tolle's. We need the mindfulness people. Our mental health epidemic is so severe. We need as much people focused on this, helping as we can. This book is not about me at all. This book is about helping others. We need thousands of other people like me and Eckhart Tolle to also help, because this mental health issue is a big, big, big deal.
Absolutely. Can you run us through some of those knots and some of the solutions that you're finding based on the science that has been brought out recently to present the efficacy of these solutions for them?
Sure. So, and they're presented in a particular order. And so there are 11 knots, kind of like knots in a rope that you untie. You just have to untie the knot, and the rope is back to being a rope, right? It's that simple. It starts with stress. We all have stress. And for each chapter, I sort of walk through what is stress from a medical perspective. What are the consequences of overactive stress, and how do you heal it? You'll see that same theme throughout each chapter. So for stress, it is mindful relaxation, right? It's relaxing, turning on the relaxation response, which some people have called the polyvagal response, and it's called the relaxation response, but doing it mindfully, being present for those moments of relaxation. So not, taking a bath and then reaching for your phone. No, mindful relaxation is take the bath, spend 20 minutes, be relaxed, right? And there's many different ways of triggering that relaxation response. I talk about it in the book. So lots of options in there, but that's number one. Number two is emotional pain. And so I walk through emotional pain, how it gets triggered in the brain, sort of old memories coming up from the default mode network, triggering emotions which happen in the limbic system, the consequences of that, and how to reverse emotional pain. Silencing the default mode through things like mindfulness exercises or prayer, severing that link between a memory and an emotion, but strongest of all, the power of forgiveness, right? Which is at the heart of Christian practice, Buddhist practice, truly forgiving what happened in the past, moving on. A lot of people are stuck in the past. They don't want to forgive. Maybe it's something you've done yourself. So self-forgiveness, which is take accountability, feel the remorse, start to restore and resolve your issues. So number two is emotional pain. Three is a big topic, addictive craving, which is my term for addiction. And, we think addiction, drugs and alcohol, maybe that doesn't involve me at all. But addictive craving can involve checking your smartphone all the time, craving for food, for money, for gambling, the stock market. There's hundreds of them. And so the process there is realizing and understanding, because what happens in addiction is your default mode network and a part of your brain called the nucleus accumbens takes over the brain, and you lose sort of rational control, voluntary control. So with addictive craving, the remedy is surrendering that ego, coming to realize this default mode is taking me to a bad place. You surrender that. You can surrender to a higher power. You can surrender to your subconscious mind. There's Christian-based, Buddhist-based, and non-religious-based techniques in there. But it's surrendering and then developing insight or insightful awareness, relying on that higher power to guide you out of that darkness. That's a really big topic, but I walk through this, and I've had people tell me that chapter was the best chapter because I freed myself from all of this checking of the phone and vaping and all. I've kind of freed myself. Thank you for that. So that's one. And then loneliness is one. The remedy there is developing compassion. Negativity is a knot. The remedy there is what's called equanimity, coming to understand your brain has these judgmental thinking, and developing equanimity, which is at the heart of Stoic practice from many years ago. Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius. Then there's dishonesty and denial, very big problem. Integrity is the remedy there. Inaction or procrastination. The remedy there is developing your focus, and there's ways of training your mind to be more focused, more productive. Exercises I talk about in the book. And then dissatisfaction, right? Wanting something better than what you have now, which is big right now. Like you're on your Instagram and you're like, oh, my friend's there. I wish I was there. We're constantly living in dissatisfaction. So there it's awakening to reality, truly awakening to reality. And I talk about what is reality. When you really come to realize what reality is, it's mind-blowing, and it's the power of awe, which basically connects you to that central executive, your higher self. And then lastly, poor lifestyle, which is diet, sleep, and exercise. I walk through how can you improve that? And then it ends with resistance to change or sort of stubbornness. And the antidote there is developing your resilience. So what all of this leads to is what has been called a state of enlightenment, right? I mean, I sort of define that as a state where when you look inside, you see light, right? You see love, and that love emanates out. I see that in my 3-year-old, right? He's enlightened because he's full of light and love. So I think what you're doing is you're replacing that darkness inside, and you're replacing it with the seeds of light and hope. That's what I call enlightenment, and that ultimately leads to that higher self. So,
yeah, that's fascinating. Actually, I love the way that you've broken that down, and it makes sense as to why they are the specific chapters in the book as well. And I feel that, if you took all of those things away, which are the antidote to the challenges that we go through, and package that up into a human, you'd have a pretty damn fantastic human in front of you. And you mentioned Stoic philosophy as well. And I think that a lot of the insights that we find in Stoic philosophy really do embed themselves within these reflections and these outcomes and solutions that you've come up with as well. So it's interesting that that's a link there as well. It's very clear. Like, I did a lot of research on Stoic philosophy some years ago, and it's been a bit of a practice in my life, and everything you were saying was kind of linking back to it. And it's interesting that that's what you came to as well. And now I'm interested, obviously, we get these insights, we understand the antidotes. I have 2 questions. The first is, when it comes to looking at those knots, is it advantageous to go in the order that you kind of said, or is it better to maybe look at the one that you're struggling with the most and start there?
I would. It really helps to go through in this order, because all these knots are interlinked. You may not realize that the core issue of your, let's say, anxiety or depression is emotional pain from long ago. So you go to a doctor, and the doctor will say, all right, take this medicine, and your issue isn't resolved. The root of the issue is still there. So it is important to walk through the emotional pain, resolve any issue there, walk through the stress. And so you can go ahead to your chapter, but I would definitely start, from the beginning. And it is a process. Yeah, absolutely.
No, that's fair. And like you mentioned, I imagine that there'll be plenty of knock-on effects, right? Like, you maybe start working on the first 2 knots, and all of a sudden, at least maybe they're not completely undone by the time you get to them, but they could be a lot looser than if you started there, right? And sometimes
exactly right.
It's like when people ask me, should I work on my physical or mental health first? And it's not to say that, it depends on where you're at, of course. But generally speaking, if you sleep a little bit better, if you're exercising, getting outdoors, you're eating a little bit better as well, you're going to be in a much better position to navigate your mental well-being. So my perspective is that, if you're not resistant to working on your physical health, if you're not resistant to working on your physical health, then go at it, because it's going to help you with your mental challenges as well. So I like that perspective as well. And then the second question I had off the back of that is, life is life. Things are going to come up, and you've probably worked through a lot of these different knots. But then what happens when the big thing comes along that knocks you off your stride?
Absolutely.
You get this a lot in life, in the sense that, some people will say, well, you've developed such resilience and consciousness and all this type of stuff that if those hard hits come, you should be able to kind of shake them off. But as we know, that's not the reality for everyone. So what do we do when life comes and it comes hard?
That is why the very last knot is resistance to change, or that stubbornness, because when, let's say, you've untied all the knots, you're in a much better place, and God forbid something traumatic happens in your life, and you have that instinct of going back to the old ways, looking for to your old addiction to help you get you out of that. That is why it's important to develop your resilience. And the way I do it every single day is I sort of imagine myself on this road to an awakened state, let's say, and I ask myself, am I on the road? And sometimes I'm not on the road. Sometimes I've veered off. I've had a difficult conversation, and I can see that I'm off the road. I look inside. Am I at ease? No, I'm not at ease. And so every single morning I say, let's get back on the road, state the intention, and I do a prayer. I say, Lord God Almighty, keep me on the road to this awakened state. And so every day, and spirituality can work for some people, mindfulness can work for some people, for other people it's exercise, many different ways to develop your resilience, but it's something you want to actively cultivate. And studies have shown that people who cultivate that resilience, cancer patients, diabetes patients, they have much better outcomes. And so that's, again, you can see science coming into the foray here. But very important. So very important.
So a lot of self-accountability, I guess, and making sure that you're checking in on yourself, and also maybe not resting on your laurels too much either. I think the same happens again if I relate this to my industry of health and fitness. A lot of people get very, very comfortable with the position they've gotten themselves into, and then they stray away from the habits and things that they did that got them to the place in the first place. But so for me, it's, please go for it.
Sorry, I was just going to give the example of diet. Okay, so there are a number of good diets out there and pills now that can make you lose 10, 20, 30 pounds of weight in weeks to months. But for the vast majority of people, the weight comes back. Why is it? It's because they haven't resolved, let's say, an underlying emotional pain or an underlying craving, which is going to come back up in the future. So that's why it's important to resolve those issues so that once you've lost the weight, you'll keep the weight off. You're not eating to deal with depression, or you're not eating as a way of coping with some underlying emotional pain. So again, this is all interrelated, and we need to take this holistic view going forward, which we're not doing in medicine. I can tell you that. It's a big problem.
Yeah, I like this very integrative, holistic approach that you're talking about. And I think that is the key wherever you look in life. You know, as much as some people will love to look at their data 112%, and other people will like to look towards their spirituality 112%. There's nothing wrong with either of those two, but I think a blend of both seems to be the solution for many, many situations that we go through. And I do have a question about maybe playing devil's advocate here and wondering, is there any advantage to being heavily, obviously, let's take mental health. We can't really take mental health off the table, but let's take it off the table, for example, for a second, I should say. And we look into the geniuses of the world, and usually we associate them with a little bit of insanity, a little bit of obsessiveness. You know, we talked about Elon Musk earlier, and I've heard him speak on interviews saying that, you know, you wouldn't actually want to be in my mind. It's a pretty horrendous place to be. And, you know, we don't know what his life looks like when it comes to, you know, his family and his personal relationships, but we see what he does and we marvel at his genius. So is there a argument to say that perhaps for some people who are maybe not prioritizing their mental health and want to prioritize these fascinating things that they're achieving in life, then maybe not tapping into this so much is a good idea?
Yeah, that's a good question. So again, we all need a healthy default mode network to be successful and to thrive, right? And when you have that difficult argument with somebody and the next day you remember it and suddenly, oh, there's a solution to that, right? That default mode network has improved your life. There was a guy at University of Cambridge who was trying to crack what's called the Sanskrit code, which no one had ever decoded before. And he looked at it and he was so frustrated, he took a few weeks off and went and did some mindfulness and took a vacation basically, came back to it, saw the code, and the solution was right there, right? So, you know, the default mode and the way we need a healthy default mode for those insights to solve our problems. Elon Musk, I can't really speak to, but what I would say is, you know, he mentioned himself, right, that his brain is always off in some direction. And it's not that he said, not everyone should be where I am here. It's not a very happy place. There was a study that showed that a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. You know, when that mind wanders, it tends to take us to an unhappy place. So I think this is really about mental balance and well-being, where we come to heal our default mode and use it for our success, right? We don't want to ignore it. We don't want to get angry when it shows up, but we want to be trying to head to a place where our mind is in balance and we've got a healthy default mode. We've got a healthy central executive. We're happy and we want to help others. And we're successful at the same time. So, you know, this isn't about go off to some retreat for a month and live in a cave, right? This is about living in the real world. We've got stresses in life, And how do we get to a much happier place where we can still be productive and successful, basically? And I think the story is going to continue. I don't think we've reached our pinnacle as Homo sapiens. I think we've got a lot of progress left. But hopefully the Elon Musk that come in the next 2-3 generations are a lot happier, more compassionate, more giving, and people we aspire to be because they're helping humanity and are examples of happiness and contentment. So more to come.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of people, there'll be 95% of people out there who resonate with this message, are looking for success in their life, but they are looking for happiness, balance, and all the other things as well. But I know that there's a lot of people, specifically those who listen to podcasts as well, who are hyper focused on, getting the cutting edge when it comes to productivity, effectiveness. They're very, very based around outputs. And they'll say, my active mind is actually one of my biggest advantages. It's one of my biggest strengths. And to turn that off would be to turn off all of my, they kind of identify with it to a degree. They kind of wear it as a badge of honor.
Right.
So I'm wondering if we're going to be able to find a way in which maybe that's where the science comes in and they can't deny the data. But I'm wondering if we're going to be able to tap into that, because if I know that your book kind of taps into the personal development route, and I think a lot of people in that space will be looking for those edges. But I think that, maybe it's thinking about, okay, maybe the productivity and being really, really switched on and having overactive default mode network might help you in these next few years. But if you're thinking about longevity and what's going to help you across 30 to 60 years, that's maybe where you need to find that balance.
Yeah. So the way I would describe being in that optimal state, I would call it being in the zone, right? When you're in the zone, you are present, you are focused, and you have those insights that make you productive, right? And you've got to get out of that mindset that it's me, I, the world is about me, I, and constantly judging and reacting, which is where the default mode can take you. So what I'm saying is get out of that mindset where the world is about me, I, mine, what I need right now. Get out of that a little bit. Go into this observing mind where it's not about you. You have this more expansive consciousness where you can be present, you can be in the zone, and see what it does to your productivity. See what it does. I will guarantee if you can get in the zone and spend more time in that observing mind, I'm willing to bet you'll be more productive, more successful. I'm willing to bet people will want to spend more time with you and want to collaborate with you. And so, so again, I'm not saying shut your mind off. I'm saying switch over from that default mode, me, I, and try switching to this other mind, the observing mind. See what it does for you. It's not going to happen overnight. What you're doing is you're training that salience network, that third network. You're training it to spend more time in the observing mind. It takes time to do that. You can't take a pill. This takes a little bit of practice. It took me a couple of months, but wow. I'm so glad I'm not 100% in that world of me, I, my craving. I don't like this person, judgmental. Oh, I'm glad I'm out of that.
Yeah, I can imagine. And can audio and visual cues help you with that as well to promote that third network? For example, I know hearing the shut of your laptop at the end of the day, and then that kind of puts you into the observer mind because now you're going to be present with your children, for example.
Yeah, and different people are wired differently. So, in Buddhist practice, it's taught to follow your breath. For some people, that works really well because their brain is tuned to that, but it doesn't work well for others. Maybe sounds will work for some people. Being active, and for some people it might be reading, it might be, gardening or hiking or being in nature, right? What I would do is spend 10 minutes a day. First, observe your mind before this exercise. Kind of just take a look. Whatever you see inside, that's, take a reflection. Spend 10 minutes doing whatever exercises, and they're all listed in the book. And then after 10 minutes, take a look and just see how you feel. And so this is self-understanding. Only you know yourself. You have to figure out what are the exercises that work best for me and turning on that observing mind. So for me, it's sound. Music does it for me. And being in nature, that absolutely does it for me. Prayer really works for me. It doesn't for others. So you got to figure out what works best for you. Yeah.
I'm not surprised that a lot of it is getting offline and getting into the real world. That somehow doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, again, and not to say being online is bad, being on the phone is bad. I mean, it is for a lot of people, but this is the reality of our work. We have to answer emails. We have to. So I think I wouldn't judge something as bad. Email is bad. No, that doesn't solve anything. It's reframing your relationship with email so that you have power over it, right? And you can cut out the non-essential stuff.
For sure. I like that a lot. This is really fascinating stuff. And I want to wrap up with the final two questions I have for you, Hosein. So the first is, what impact do you want to have on the world with the work that you do?
I would like to just help people out there who are looking for help. It could be 5 people. It could be 5,000. It doesn't matter. I don't have a motive with this book to make money, to rise up any social ladder. I'm not here to develop a subscription package. I'm just purely to help people. And that's it. So if it helps you, let me know. I would love to hear, actually. It would make my day. I had somebody tell me this, one of my books helped them, and that was an amazing, that was one of the best accomplishments I've ever had. Hearing somebody say, thank you, you helped me. I mean, wow. And yeah, so that's ultimately the goal.
Amazing. Is your book available on Audible as well, in audiobook form?
I need to develop that, but it is available on Amazon. It's on Apple Books. It's you can get it on online at Barnes and Noble and other places. But yeah, I will work on Audible, and I will work on other translations at some point. There's just so much going on.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. And where's the best place for people to keep up with the work that you're doing on social media?
Yeah, yourdefaultmode.com is the website. One word, so yourdefaultmode.com. You can see a podcast there, and you can preview the book for free if you'd like. And all the social media links are there as well. At the very bottom, you can just click on it.
Amazing. Hosein, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for your work, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Elliot. Thanks for all you're doing as well.